The judges humiliated the little girl for being black, but she silenced them when she sang. "With all due respect, dear, are you sure you're in the right place?" Judge Harrison's question echoed through the luxurious auditorium of the National Talent Academy like a resounding slap. "This is a competition for promising young artists." Ruby Johnson, just 13 years old, stood firm in the center of the lit stage, holding the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a restrained anger that few could control with such dignity. Around her, the other 50 participating children whispered among themselves, some clearly embarrassed, others trying to hide cruel giggles. "Yes, ma'am. I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied in a soft voice that contrasted with the fire in her dark eyes. Judge Campbell, sitting majestically at the head table, didn't even bother to look up from her notes. "Well, then show us what you've brought. We hope it's appropriate for the level of this institution." The third judge, Mr. Montgomery, whispered something to his colleagues that elicited discreet smiles, but audible enough for Ruby to hear fragments like "realistic" and "don't get your hopes up." Ruby had grown up in the East Oak neighborhood, where the sound of freight trains mingled with nighttime sirens and where opportunities like this simply didn't exist for girls like her. Her mother, a nurse who worked 3 shifts, had saved every penny for 2 years to pay for the registration fee for this national competition that promised a full scholarship to the most prestigious music conservatory in the country. "What song did you choose?" Harrison asked with an impatient sigh, as if he already knew he was wasting his time. "Amazing Grace," Ruby replied, completely ignoring the surprised looks from the other competitors. It was a risky choice, a song traditionally associated with the civil rights struggle, sung in churches for generations, completely outside the classical repertoire expected in that elitist environment. "How interesting," Campbell muttered, finally looking up. "Well, let's get this over with." At that moment, as the spotlights burned her skin and prejudiced whispers filled the air around her, Ruby closed her eyes for a moment. Her grandmothers had sung this song during historic marches. Her great-grandmother had sung it in the cotton fields. And now, she would sing it on that stage where she was clearly not welcome. What those judges didn't know was that Ruby hadn't gotten there by chance or luck. In recent weeks, she had discovered something about the National Talent Academy that would change everything, information she kept as a secret trump card, waiting for just the right moment to use it. When she opened her eyes again, there was a dangerous serenity in her gaze that made Mr. Montgomery pause his half-smile. It was the kind of calm that only exists in those who have weathered much worse storms and discovered that they possess a power far greater than anyone could imagine. If this story of prejudice and overcoming adversity touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a moment of humiliation would turn into something those judges would never forget. But as Ruby prepared to sing, Judge Campbell did something that made everyone's blood run cold. She openly pulled out her cell phone and started typing, as if the girl's performance were too irrelevant to deserve attention. Mr. Montgomery sighed loudly, glanced at his watch, and muttered to Harrison, "How long do we have to pretend we're evaluating?" "Amazing Grace, what a predictable choice," Harrison commented, not even bothering to lower his voice. "It's always the same with these kinds of candidates. They think a song with emotional history will make up for their lack of classical technique." Ruby felt every word like a knife, but it wasn't the first time. Throughout her life, she had faced similar comments. At school, where teachers expressed surprise when she got high grades. At the supermarket, where security guards discreetly followed her through the aisles. And now here, in the place where her voice should speak for itself, where talent should be the only currency accepted. What those judges didn't know was that Ruby had grown up in the Mount Sinai Baptist Church choir, directed by her grandmother Dorothy, a woman who had sung on gospel tours in the 1970s and taught 3 generations of children that music was more than entertainment. It was resistance, it was strength, it was survival. Every Sunday, Ruby would climb onto that small makeshift stage and sing for a congregation that loved her unconditionally, that shouted "Amen" and "Sing Girl" when her voice hit impossible notes. "You can start whenever you're ready," Campbell said without looking up from his cell phone. "But make it quick. We have more promising candidates to evaluate." It was then that Ruby remembered her mother's words from the night before. "Honey, sometimes God puts you in places where you're not welcome precisely because He needs someone to show those places how wrong they are." But there was something else. 3 weeks earlier, while researching the National Talent Academy for her application, Ruby had discovered something that left her speechless. In the institution's publicly available online archives, she found the records of winners from the last 20 years. In 2 decades, only 2 black candidates had been selected, and both in years when the Academy was facing lawsuits for racial discrimination. Even more revealing, she had discovered that Mr. Montgomery, one of the judges now looking at her with disdain, had a son who had been rejected in a similar audition 3 years earlier at another institution, and he had filed a lawsuit alleging bias against white middle-class applicants. The lawsuit was documented in the courts, with Montgomery arguing that forced diversity had hurt his son's chances. Ruby also discovered something about Judge Campbell that would change everything. But that would have to wait for the right moment. "We're waiting," Harrison said, drumming his fingers on the table with irritating impatience. At that moment, Ruby closed her eyes and mentally transported herself to Mount Sinai. She could hear her grandmother's voice. "When you sing to God, child, you are singing with the power of all who came before you. Let them sing through you." When she opened her eyes, there was something different about her posture. No longer the nervous girl who had entered that auditorium, but someone who carried centuries of music, resilience, and strength in her voice. "I'm going to sing now," Ruby said, her voice echoing with an authority that finally made Campbell look up from his cell phone. What those 3 judges didn't know was that they were about to witness not just an audition, but the beginning of something that would forever change the reputation of the National Academy of Talent. Ruby hadn't come there just to sing, she had come to seek justice. And every note she was about to sing carried not only her voice, but the strength of an entire community that had been systematically excluded from those stages. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside her that her oppressors couldn't see, a silent force fueled by the very injustice they tried to impose, growing like a storm they should never have provoked. "I'm going to sing now," Ruby said, but something in the way her words echoed through the auditorium made Judge Campbell finally look up from her phone. There was a strange authority in that young voice, not teenage defiance, but something far more dangerous, absolute confidence. Mr. Montgomery chuckled softly. "Make it quick, dear. It's already 5:30, and I have an important dinner." He turned to Harrison and whispered loudly enough for Ruby to hear, "At least when this is over, we can congratulate ourselves for giving diversity a chance. The Ethics Committee will be pleased with our numbers." Ruby closed her eyes for a moment. 3 weeks of meticulous research had revealed much more than she had initially imagined. The discovery about Montgomery's lawsuit was just the beginning. The real bombshell was related to Judge Campbell. 2 weeks earlier, Ruby had found a 1995 newspaper article buried in the digital archives of the municipal library. The headline was devastating: "Music professor fired for plagiarizing students' compositions." The black and white photo showed a much younger woman, but one unmistakably recognizable as Margaret Campbell. For 5 years, she had stolen original compositions from her college students and registered them under her own name, building an entire academic career based on other people's talents. But Ruby had much more than an old article. She had recordings. 2 nights before the audition, Ruby had arrived early at the academy to practice. In fact, she had set up a small tape recorder, borrowed from her journalist cousin Marcus, in the auditorium, hidden under one of the front row chairs. What she captured over the next 2 hours would change everything. Campbell, Harrison, and Montgomery had gathered for a pre-selection, openly discussing how they would manipulate the results. "We need at least one black person in the semifinals," Campbell said with casual disdain. "Enough to show that we're inclusive, but not enough for them to actually win." "What about that little girl from East Oak?" Harrison asked. "Ruby something?" "She won't make it past the first round," Montgomery replied with arrogant certainty. "I'll personally make sure she understands her place." But there was more. Campbell had made a confession that sealed his fate. "My reputation has been carefully rebuilt. I won't allow some kid from the projects to threaten it again. I've destroyed promising careers before, and I'll do it again if necessary." Ruby was not alone in her preparation. Dr. Williams, director of the Mount Sinai Choir and retired professor of civil rights at Howard University, had become her mentor and strategic ally when she shared her findings with him. "Child," he had said, reviewing the evidence Ruby had compiled, "you didn't just come here to sing. You came here to seek justice." Dr. Williams had used his contacts to verify every piece of information Ruby had uncovered. He confirmed that Campbell had never been formally investigated for plagiarism because her victims, young students without resources at the time, had been intimidated into silence. But now, with Ruby's recordings and the records he had helped locate, they had irrefutable evidence of a pattern of behavior that had been destroying talent for decades. "What do you plan to do?" Dr. Williams had asked. Ruby smiled with a serenity that belied her age. I'm going to sing for them, Dr. Williams. I'm going to sing like they've never heard before. And then I'll show them who they really are. As the judges waited impatiently, Ruby discreetly opened her bag and checked that the small transmitter was working. Dr. Williams was outside, recording everything in real time, ready to send the evidence to media contacts who were already waiting. But Ruby had saved the best for last. Hidden in the lining of her bag was a letter from 1995, written in Campbell's own hand to the dean of the university where she worked, confessing her crimes in detail and begging not to be prosecuted. The letter Campbell thought had been destroyed had survived in the personal files of her former victim, Sarah Jenkins, now a successful songwriter who had kept the evidence for 28 years, waiting for the right opportunity to use it. Sarah had found Ruby through Dr. Williams, and upon discovering that the young woman would confront Campbell, she immediately offered her collaboration. It's time for this woman to pay for what she's done, Sarah had said, handing Ruby not only the letter, but also records of at least a dozen other victims of Campbell over the years. We're waiting, Harrison repeated with growing irritation, but Ruby just smiled. She knew that in the next 5 minutes, she would not only sing Amazing Grace. She would sing the requiem for the corrupt careers of those 3 judges. Each note would be an accusation, each verse a revelation, each word a bomb carefully rigged to explode centuries of privilege and prejudice masked as academic tradition. The 3 judges had no idea that they were about to witness not just an audition, but the public collapse of their own reputations built on systematic discrimination and academic corruption. For a moment, when Ruby adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath, everyone thought they were watching just another nervous young woman trying to impress her superiors. But anyone watching closely would have noticed that it wasn't nervousness that made her hands grip the microphone with such determination. It was the restrained power of someone about to rewrite not only her own history, but the history of all those who had been silenced before her. Ruby took a deep breath, and when she began to sing, the world stopped. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice echoed through the auditorium like a force of nature, not just music, but pure emotion transformed into sound. Each note carried centuries of struggle, each word vibrated with the authority of someone who knows both suffering and hope. The malicious whispers died instantly. Campbell dropped his cell phone from his hands. Harrison sat up straight in his chair as if he had been electrocuted. That saved a wretch like me. Ruby's voice reached registers that made the other participating children look at each other with amazement and envy. It wasn't just perfect technique, it was pure soul pouring through vocal cords that seemed to have been blessed by the angels themselves. Montgomery tried to maintain his expression of disdain, but his eyes betrayed the shock of witnessing something genuinely extraordinary. I once was lost, but now am found. When Ruby held the high note for an impossible 15 seconds, without any tremor or apparent effort, the silence in the auditorium became deathly. Every person present knew they were witnessing something rare, the kind of talent that comes along once in a generation. Was blind, but now I see. Ruby finished the song, and for a moment that seemed like an eternity, only the echo of her voice remained in the air. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was beautiful, don't you think? Ruby said, her voice now carrying an authority that made the 3 judges shift uncomfortably. Especially considering that you had already decided to fail me before you even heard me. Campbell tried to speak, but Ruby raised a hand. Oh, don't worry. I have proof. Ruby opened her bag and took out a small recorder. Dr. Williams, can you activate the live stream? From the back of the auditorium, an elegant gray-haired man nodded. Simultaneously, the Academy National Talent social media accounts began streaming live to their 2.3 million followers. Recording from 2 days ago, Ruby announced, pressing play. The familiar voices of Campbell, Harrison, and Montgomery filled the auditorium. We need at least one black person in the semifinals. Enough to show we're inclusive, but not enough for them to actually win. What about that little girl from East Oak? Ruby something. She won't make it past the first round. I'll personally make sure she understands her place. Montgomery's face turned gray. Harrison tried to stand up, but his legs failed him. Campbell, however, tried to attack. This is a setup. You can't just. Margaret Campbell, Ruby interrupted, pulling a yellowed envelope from her purse. Or should I call you by the name you used in 1995 when you were fired from Stevens University for plagiarizing your own students' compositions? Campbell turned completely pale. How did you? Sarah Jenkins kept this letter for 28 years. Ruby unfolded the paper carefully. Your handwritten confession, admitting to stealing at least 12 original compositions from students to build your academic career. Signed by you, begging not to be criminally prosecuted. The murmur in the auditorium turned into a roar. Several people began filming with their cell phones. Campbell tried to lunge forward to snatch the letter, but Ruby gracefully stepped back. Sarah wasn't your only victim, was she? For 28 years, you systematically destroyed young talent to protect your false reputation. How many Ruby Johnsons have you silenced over the decades? Stop this immediately. Harrison shouted, finally finding his voice. You're a minor. You can't do this without legal authorization. Ruby laughed, a musical, devastating sound. Legal authorization? Dr. Williams, can you confirm your identity for everyone, please? Dr. Williams approached the stage. Dr. Robert Williams, Professor Emeritus of Civil Rights at Howard University and a lawyer registered in the state for 35 years. Miss Johnson has been under my legal representation since we decided to expose this institutionalized farce. Harrison tried one more desperate card. Even if that's true, she's just a kid from the suburbs. She has no credentials, no classical training. Credentials. Ruby smiled again. I have something better than fake credentials and diplomas bought with privilege. I have real talent. And you know it. Ruby motioned to Dr. Williams, who began projecting the records of the National Talent Academy's winners from the last 20 years onto the auditorium's main screen. 2 black names in 2 decades. Montgomery, Ruby said, turning to the third judge. In 2020, your son Marcus was rejected at an audition for the Conservatory Alliance. You filed a lawsuit alleging discrimination against middle-class white applicants, arguing that diversity policies hurt his chances. The lawsuit is in the public record. Montgomery tried to deny it, but Ruby continued, your son was rejected because he couldn't sing. It's that simple. But you'd rather believe there's a conspiracy against privileged mediocrities than admit that true talent can come from anywhere. Cell phone cameras multiplied. The hashtag Academy scandal was already being used in hundreds of posts. Campbell tried one last desperate move. You don't understand. This girl is trying to destroy a reputable institution. I'm not destroying anything, Ruby interrupted with absolute calm. You've been doing that yourselves for decades. I'm just showing the world who you really are. Dr. Williams approached with an official document. Margaret Campbell, Harrison Mitchell, and Douglas Montgomery, you're being formally notified of a lawsuit for systematic racial discrimination, falsification of academic records, and violation of civil rights. The national media has already been informed. Campbell collapsed into her chair. Harrison tried to escape through the back door, but found reporters waiting. Montgomery simply stood still, staring into space, realizing that his 40-year career had ended in 15 minutes. Ruby took the microphone one last time. Amazing Grace was my great-grandmother's favorite song. She sang it in the cotton fields, dreaming of a day when her great-granddaughter could sing on any stage, judged only by her voice. Today, finally, that day has come. As camera flashes lit up the auditorium and the 3 former judges faced the reality of their destroyed careers, Ruby remained center stage with the serenity of someone who knew she had done more than seek personal justice. She had opened a door that could never be closed again for all the true talent that would come after her. But as chaos ensued around them and the former judges faced the destruction of their reputations, one question remained unanswered. How had a 13-year-old girl from the suburbs managed to orchestrate such a devastatingly perfect exposure, and what else had she discovered about the National Talent Academy that was yet to be revealed? 6 months later, Ruby Johnson stood on the main stage of Lincoln Center in New York, preparing for her debut performance as a full scholarship student at the Juilliard Conservatory, the same institution that had rejected hundreds of traditional applicants to make a special place for her after the National Talent Academy scandal went viral worldwide. The hashtag Amazing Grace revolution had racked up over 50 million views, and the original recording of Ruby singing in the auditorium of that corrupt academy had become one of the most shared videos in the history of social media. Entertainment companies were vying for contracts with her. 3 documentaries about discrimination in arts education were being produced based on her story. Ladies and gentlemen, the presenter announced to the packed audience that included international music critics, Miss Ruby Johnson. As Ruby walked gracefully to center stage, wearing an elegant navy blue dress that her mother had bought with the first payment from her new record deal, she thought about the devastating consequences that her 15 minutes of courage had caused. Margaret Campbell had been formally dismissed from the National Academy of Talent and was facing criminal charges in 3 states for academic fraud. Her professional reputation was completely destroyed. Sarah Jenkins and 11 other victims of Campbell's plagiarism had joined forces in a class action lawsuit that had already resulted in millions of dollars in damages. Campbell, now 61, lived in a modest apartment, surviving on sporadic work as a private tutor, her brilliant career reduced to ashes by the weight of decades of crimes finally exposed. Harrison Mitchell had tried to save his career by moving abroad, but Ruby's recordings had been translated into 17 languages. Wherever he tried to work, someone recognized his voice from the viral recordings. His name became internationally synonymous with prejudice disguised as academic tradition. His wife had left him, his children had changed their last name, and he lived in isolation in a small town in the countryside, bitter and broke. Montgomery had suffered the most ironic fate of all. His 2020 lawsuit against the Conservatory Alliance was re-examined in light of revelations about his participation in the Academy's systematic discrimination. The lawsuit was not only dismissed, but he was ordered to pay astronomical legal fees for litigating in bad faith. His son Marcus, whose mediocrity had been masked by privilege for years, had to face the reality that he had never had enough talent to compete legitimately. Montgomery lost his home, his investments, and now worked as an insurance salesman in a town where no one knew his past. But the most profound transformation had taken place at the National Academy of Talent itself. Dr. Williams had temporarily taken over as director during the federal investigation, implementing radical changes that transformed the institution into a model of inclusion and transparency. Auditions were now recorded in their entirety, evaluators underwent anti-discrimination training, and candidates from all social backgrounds received financial support to participate. "You are in for something special," Dr. Williams had told the Lincoln Center audience before introducing Ruby. "This young woman has not just come to sing for you. She has come to show you why true music has never known boundaries of color, social class, or any limitation invented by small minds." Ruby took a deep breath, looking out at the packed audience that included Hollywood producers, directors of European conservatories, and talent agents who had flown in from other continents just to hear her. In the front rows, her mother smiled with tears in her eyes, next to her grandmother Dorothy, who proudly held an autographed program. "Tonight," Ruby said into the microphone, her voice echoing with the same natural authority that had silenced an auditorium of bigots 6 months earlier, "I will sing Amazing Grace once again. Not because I need to prove myself again, but because I want to honor all those who came before me and pave the way for all those who will come after." As her voice filled Lincoln Center, each note carried not only impeccable technique honed by months of intensive training, but also the strength of someone who had turned humiliation into revolution. Record executives whispered ever-increasing offers. Music critics mentally drafted reviews that would compare her performance to music legends. At the end of the performance, during the 5 uninterrupted minutes of standing ovation, Ruby remembered that 13-year-old girl who had entered a hostile auditorium carrying only an exceptional voice and an iron determination to do justice. That girl had discovered that sometimes the best revenge is not to destroy your enemies, but to build something so brilliant that it renders their darkness irrelevant. Later, in interviews that would be broadcast globally, Ruby would be asked about forgiveness and reconciliation. Her response would become one of the most shared quotes of the decade: "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering so that others never go through the same thing." Campbell, Harrison, and Montgomery paid for their crimes not because I sought revenge, but because I sought truth. The difference between revenge and justice is that justice protects those who come after you. 3 years later, Ruby would be the youngest artist to receive a Grammy in the Best Classical Vocal Performance category. Her acceptance speech would begin with the same words that ended that fateful day at the Academy: "Amazing Grace was my great-grandmother's favorite song. Today, I dedicate this award to all the voices that have been silenced throughout history, and I promise that as long as I have this platform, no true note will go unheard." The lesson Ruby Johnson taught the world was simple but revolutionary. True talent doesn't ask permission to shine, and genuinely excellent institutions aren't afraid of diversity, they celebrate it. Sometimes it takes 15 minutes of courage to break down centuries of institutionalized prejudice. What about you? Have you witnessed situations where true talent was ignored because of prejudice? How did you react? Share your story in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that justice, when combined with genuine talent, always finds its way into the light.